Let's talk about defense in depth and discuss how a network architecture designed to attend to best practices is going to be really important to understand as a software developer. The first thing I'd like to talk about is going to be mainly focused on the architecture. And in reality, every one of us will be working on a very different network architecture. And our applications will be deployed somewhat differently based on where we're at, what company, what sector, and we need to take that into account. But what I'd like to do here is just do a high level overview of how layers of security could be applied in the best practice of defense in depth. Over here, I have basically our company resources on-prem services. We have two offices, Boston and San Jose. But we also use cloud services, and again, it could be any cloud provider. And if you're not familiar with the region, for example, region is going to be basically a geographic area where the cloud services are deployed. For example, like US East, US West, US Central, Asia Pacific, wherever that region is. And that's associated with the cloud provider, whether it's AWS, IBM, Google, or Azure. When we're looking at our application, that application typically is going to be deployed usually for at least one, if not several types of users. For example, if we have a application being developed around, for example, an online service that is going to sell, for example, services, or it's going to sell some kind of digital asset. Or we may be a company that doesn't sell anything over the internet. We may be a manufacturing company or whatever that type of organization is, or we could be educational. Whatever that company is, we need to realize, first of all, what are the types of customers and partners we may have, but also the users internally as well. For example, we would want to consider, of course, different levels of permission, accountability, as well as a significant layer of authentication, authorization as well. If we're developing applications, let's say for our corporate users, we may want to look at that deployment a little differently than if it's for our customers or partners. For example, we may only allow our customers and partners to access specific resources, and those resources may actually only be in the cloud. On the other hand, we may have, for example, resources that might be human resource applications. Payroll may also be, for example, legal applications, compliance-based applications that are going to be only accessed on premises, for example. However, we may very well want to use resources in San Jose and in Boston in this example. The question is do we allow traffic to go over a private connection, for example, to Boston, or do we have to traverse out into the internet and then go back in? It's all about understanding our interconnection strategy. So that's one thing we need to think about. So let's go ahead and write that down. Make sure we think about that as well. Understand, for example, do we connect with a VPN or do we have a private connection? It's all about understanding the network hardware, the network infrastructure, the network software. Now, as a developer, again, you're probably not going to be super concerned about it, but these are the questions you may want to understand and ask and make sure you understand before deploying your application. So we want to know the layers, for example, around the network. However, what about controls in our data center? Do we have, for example, internal based controls? For example, when I say controls, what I really mean are what type of devices that are going to facilitate security. So security type devices. And again, those devices are going to have controls in place. Some of those would be anything from firewalls over to proxies. Also, too, what about do we require, for example, IDS? And that IDS could be what? It could be a network-based control, an IDS, or it could be more of a host-level control. For example, a lot of companies, for example, do require that the users have malware protection installed, for example, on mobile devices, or they may need to log into the corporate network with the VPN. For example, do we have the right controls for the hosts where the application will be accessed from? Now, are we using, for example, from a protocol perspective, secure protocols? For example, are we using SSH? Or another thing too, not just for example, our customers here, but what about our users? For example, are the developers using RDP or SSH? And then from a customer perspective, again, is it SSL or is it another secure protocol that is being used like TLS? What is the protocols that are being used? Again, identifying the different layers is so important here. We need to understand everything from the interconnect strategy to the device strategy to also to the software strategy. Again, how does the browser, what type of browsers are used? How are the errors handled? A lot of things to consider here, but at a high level, please do take into account all these types of layers that could come into play. Remember, it could be anything from the network to the host, over to the software, over to internal controls as well. Let's go ahead and move on.